we're going to jump into Christmas now. Are you ready for Christmas? Let's do that. Grinch, Scrooge? No. Raise your hand if you were like, you're there, you're holly jolly, elf is on, you're good, you're ready for Christmas. Amen for you. Good. For the rest of us, just not sure it's Christmas yet? Yeah, okay. I'll be honest, it's not because of stress. I don't know if it's because of weather. I don't know if it's because we just don't have our tree yet, but it just doesn't feel like Christmas yet. And I want it to, and I'm eager for that. I'm eating like it's Christmas, mind you, but I want to feel that Christmas, and it's such a great word from Tim. Like, our feelings do not determine the situation. They don't determine God's goodness. It doesn't determine the time of year, because if it were our feelings that determine the time of year, for some of you, it will be 78 degrees all the time, forever and ever and ever, right? Yeah. But we're going to jump into Christmas. We're going to be there, dadgummit. And so we're going to talk about God. We're going to talk about Jesus' presence. And what I want you to understand, what I think is difficult for us to understand is it's difficult for us to understand the importance, the weightiness of Christ's arrival. Because we've grown up with this. We're the beneficiaries of generation after generation after generation of, well, yeah, Jesus is Messiah. We get it. But we can't understand. If you're anything like me, there seems to be a disconnect when I read Christmas stories and I read the life of Jesus. And I don't understand, why don't they get this, right? Like, why it's so difficult for them to see? It's all right here. But for them, it wasn't all right here. And so what I want us to do together is to kind of go back in time. So today's going to be a little bit of a history lesson. So if you like that, you're awesome. If you don't, hopefully you'll come back next week. But what I want us to do, and if you'll indulge me, I want to take just a minute to attempt to give us some perspective into the enormity of God's arrival for the people that were living when it happened. I want us to sense this. I want us to understand the gravity of what Jesus' life, what Jesus' presence meant, and how it changed everything. And so what you've got to consider from the very, very beginning, and let me say this as a bit of a caveat. If you're not a Christian, this is the perfect time of year to come to church, because you kind of already have heard the stories. And it's a perfect time for you to be at this church, because we're not going to assume that get it. We're not going to assume that you're bought in wholly. We want you to ask the questions, because I think that's a danger. When we stop asking questions and we start relying on our understanding and our knowledge, we tend to bog down in our growth with Christ. And so if you're not a Christian, I'm so glad you're here, and I want you to ask questions, and I want you to push back on things, because it's going to help all of us. And hopefully through this season, through this series, we're going to land in a place where we are ready for Christmas, perhaps in a different place than we ever have before. So when we look back in history, prior to Christ's arrival, prior to Jesus being born, we have to understand the context of the people to which he was sent. In the 2,000 some odd years that the Jewish people were waiting, and that's from when Abraham or Abram was called by God to leave and go to this area known as Jerusalem, Israel, all that, right? If you've heard the story of Abraham, Father Abraham had many sons, and there was a right leg involved. I'm not sure how, but it was. Okay, anybody Vacation Bible School? No, we've lost something over time. We're never going to do VBS here. Sorry. Just go to the many, many churches in town that do. But Abraham was a guy that God just picked out of nothing. There's no given reason. Abraham was not like some mighty, amazing, godly, God-fearing guy. God just picked him, which I love, because I give God no reason to pick me, and he does. So I take some solace in this. I can't identify with people in the New Testament. You know, like Stephen being stoned, and he's just like standing there looking into the glory of God. Like, no. If I was being stoned, I'd be like, if there was a story about me being stoned, it probably would not involve God. Are you with me? Okay, I've never done that, but if people are going to throw rocks at me, I'm not there, okay? All right? But I can't identify with those guys. I can't identify with Peter walking on water, all right? I can identify with Abraham, who God just picks for no reason, and over and over and over again, Abraham gives him more and more reasons for God not to use him, and he does. So 2,000 years before Christ, God picks Abraham, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. This is a time that includes the entire group of people being slaves in Egypt. Slavery in Egypt is included here in this 2,000 years. It includes the Exodus, right? Deliver us, Prince of Egypt. We're there. Yeah, I love it. Okay. It includes the Exodus. It includes the rule of the judges and the elders over the people of Israel, the Jewish people. It includes the establishment of the kingdom of Israel with Saul being king. Later on, David and Solomon and all these people for years and years and years, right? It includes when that kingdom eventually is divided and falls apart and they're exiled to Babylon. You know, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? King Nebuchadnezzar, the bunny. Oh, nobody with me on the VeggieTales? Okay, you're with me, okay, good. Stay with me. I'm gonna go quick today. It includes the exile, and then it includes the Persians taking over Babylon and King Cyrus bringing relief. It includes relief under the Persians. But what happens, suddenly the Old Testament just ends. It ends, and there's centuries of perceived silence. That doesn't mean that the Jewish people ceased to exist. Far from it. The region that you and I know as Israel, the Jewish people were there, but they suffered under incredible amounts of upheaval. This is what a lot of scholars call the intertestamental period or the deuterocanonical period. It's from about 530 or 520 BC to 1st century AD. Remember, BC goes backwards, so it counts up going backward, and AD counts forward, or CE, or whatever they change it to because they're afraid of Jesus. So this is the time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's the intertestamental period. It's what you and I would call it because we're Protestants. We're not Catholics. That's what the Catholics call it, deuterocanonical period. And they have all kinds of different books. They have something called pseudepigraphy, which is really, really interesting, where they like just write a letter and decide, oh, let's pick somebody to, yeah, John wrote this, and he didn't at all. Then you also have apocryphal writings, which Catholic Bibles and several other Protestant denominations, they still use some of the apocryphal writings. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons we don't use some of these books in our Bible is because there's a story where Jesus was a young kid, maybe a preteen, and a kid cuts him off in the street one day, and he says, "You'll never do that again," and the kid just like dies. So like Jesus just like, zap. And I don't think that's what Jesus did. He did that to a fig tree, yes, but not a person, okay? So you'll hear words like that. You'll hear pseudepigraphy, you'll hear apocrypha, and it's all in this intertestamental time frame, this time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Are you still with me? Have you gone to sleep yet? Okay, we're gonna get there, okay? I want you to understand what the Jewish people faced during this time period, because when we understand this, when you understand the 2,000 years of difficulty and pain and slavery and exile and overtaken kingdoms, you start to understand the gravity of God's arrival. But you have to understand what happened then. Because in about 5th century, Cyrus the Great, which I just mentioned, he took over Babylon and he gave relief to the exiled Jewish people. He was the Persian king. He actually allowed them to go back to Jerusalem. And so he was kind of a good guy in a sense. We see all kinds of things happening. This is about 5th century BC. But then fast forward to about 4th century BC. Remember, we're going forward, going down in numbers. Alexander the Great arrives on the scene. And he conquers the Persians. Alexander the Great, which we all know, maybe you've seen some movies or read some books, big deal, expansive kingdom. He takes over the Persians, including the area that you and I know as Israel or Jerusalem. And after Alexander dies, one of his kind of right-hand men had gone down to become the ruler of the Egyptian area of his kingdom, of the Alexander the Great's kingdom. And he changed his name to Ptolemy. Like, I guess he didn't like his name and didn't sound cool enough, so he changed his name to Ptolemy. And he was Ptolemy the first, and he ruled over Egypt. And as a matter of fact, after Alexander died, he actually fought some of the other family members of Alexander and took over kind of that area again and started to rule over that. As a matter of fact, Ptolemy the First used to call his wife, or one of his wives, Cleopatra. That was her title, and that's where eventually we get that as a title of the women who ruled in Egypt. That's where that comes from. And so eventually Ptolemy's reign is overtaken by a group called the Seleucid. And this is an important part. Okay, in the 3rd century, the Seleucid dynasty conquers Ptolemy's reign over this area. And what's unique about this, and I think this is so important, as we try to live lives that understand our coworkers and our neighbors, we need to have this knowledge. Because Christians for so long have assumed that everybody understands and knows what we believe, and we kind of strut around arrogantly like that. And we fail to take the time to understand and know what other people believe. And so the importance of the Seleucid dynasty over this area is because this is where the story of Hanukkah comes from. There was a group of strong, committed Hebrew priests that a representative from the Seleucid dynasty, the ruling faction of the time, came to them and demanded a sacrifice to show their allegiance. And they refused. There's a guy named Matthias and his sons. In Judah, the Maccabee, he led a revolt that eventually ended up pushing the Seleucid, thanks to the Romans kind of fighting with Seleucid over Syria and that kind of thing. They became what we know as the Hasmonean dynasty. And there was a period of time, a little over a century, that Jewish people ruled independently of all the groups around them. Now, sometimes they were a vassal state of the Seleucid, sometimes they were a vassal state of Rome, but they were ruling essentially autonomous of any other kingdom or group. The Hasmonean dynasty, it all started from this group called the Maccabees, and that's where Hanukkah comes from, because when they decided to light the menorah or the candelabra in the temple, they only had enough oil for one day, but that one day worth of oil lasted for 8 days until they could create an unobstructed, an uncontaminated, God-honoring batch of oil to replace it. That's where Hanukkah comes from. And so we get to 2nd century where the Seleucids, the Hasmoneans are ruling autonomously their area, and then comes Rome in the 1st century. Rome takes over the Seleucid dynasty, and eventually they push into this area known as Jerusalem and Israel. And they set it up as kind of a claim state. They had rule over it, but they let them essentially function on their own. They would set up rulers. Eventually, that doesn't work out well, and so they put in place, there's a whole lot that happens. A guy named Pompey comes, and he rules, but then there's this argument between some leadership in Rome, and these guys die, and eventually we see Rome go from republic to empire. This is when Julius Caesar takes over and makes it his own. This is all happening between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they place a guy named Herod the Great in charge of the area, and he calls himself king, and that's where we have the Herodian dynasty ruling the area of Israel at this time. And then, after all of this, after centuries and millennia of time and difficulty and pain and war and exile and slavery, all of this happens to the Jewish people. And then we see Luke 2. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee to the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which was called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. So after all that, finally, Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, is here. It's a big deal. And the idea of Messiah actually having arrived seems to be something with which the religious people of Jerusalem struggled with. You see, the Jewish people and the leadership specifically, they had a preconceived idea of what Messiah would look like. And it wasn't necessarily based on the scriptures. It wasn't based on the Torah. It wasn't based on the Pentateuch or the writings or the prophets. It was based on this frustration, this generational frustration over time, and a desire to see a ruler kick out the faction of Rome and finally, forever and ever, set up a kingdom that honored God, Jehovah, that would last forever. They had an idea, a preconceived desire of what they wanted to see in Messiah. And so when Jesus shows up on the scene, they didn't want to believe it. And so they refused to recognize Jesus as Messiah. And I think we're so quick, especially American church Christianity, we're so quick to judge them like, you're so selfish. You're so selfish. How could you not see this? But when we consider all that had happened and all they had endured and try to put ourselves in their shoes, we suddenly start to get a clearer picture of the wrestling match must have been going on in their hearts and their minds of a humble, somewhat passive Messiah. And they couldn't handle it. They refused it. As a matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 15, we see an interaction between some of the religious leaders and Jesus himself, where they start to ask him and test him. And they say, well, why aren't you doing these things? Why aren't you washing your hands before you eat? The ceremonial thing. Why aren't you going by the law of Moses, the Levitical law? You're breaking all the rules that we've had. You do not fit into our preconceived idea of how Messiah is supposed to function, how Messiah is supposed to act and look like. It's not fitting for us. And Jesus quotes Isaiah to them, one of the very prophecies, one of the books of the most prophecies of his arrival. And he says to them, he says, Isaiah was right when he spoke of you. And he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Now, you and I, we have a preconceived idea of how God is supposed to intervene in our lives too. We have an idea of what God is supposed to look like, of how God is supposed to respond, what he should be doing. And like the Jewish people, we're struggling with how God's moving. We're wrestling with the silence that seems to be coming from heaven. We don't understand it. We don't like it. We don't agree with it. And without using these words, we would say things in our hearts and our minds like, well, if I were God, this is what I would do. If God is truly God, why does he let this happen? Why does he let this to continue? Why won't he provide? Why won't he heal? And we suffer. And we struggle. And we wonder, much like the Jewish people did for generations. And if we're not careful, as a matter of fact, I think it goes beyond being careful. I think if we were honest with ourselves, that we become frustrated with God simply because he doesn't do what we think he should do. And he doesn't fit our preconceived idea, our personal desire of how God is supposed to act. And so much like the Jewish leaders of Jesus' earthly time, who failed to recognize him as Messiah, you and I, in our day and age, fail to refuse to recognize Jesus as God. And if we're not careful, we are the people that Jesus was preaching at. We are the people that Isaiah was prophesying about. We are the people who honor God with our lips, but deny him with our actions. We're a people that sing songs about God, but our hearts are far from him. And in our worship, we're not worshiping him. We're teaching the commandments of men. And this is a very natural thing. I don't want this to drop on you like, oh, shame on me, I'm not a good Christian. Well, you're not a good Christian. There's no such thing as a good Christian. We suck. But we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to read God's word and to reflect on our hearts. And unlike the people of Jerusalem, we have an opportunity to break our preconceived ideas on the truth of Jesus. We have an opportunity to surrender all to God, regardless of how he's moving or working and whether or not he fits into how we think he should. So I didn't put this on the screen, but I wrote a quote by Charles Spurgeon this week. And the quote essentially said that one of our biggest hiccups with God, one of the biggest things we hold against God is one of the things we love about ourselves. And that is that we think we have the right to do with what is ours, however we choose. We're all just little sovereigns. And this is true about you as it is me. I have a right to do with my stuff as I want to do, whether it's my car or my clothes or my shoes or my children. You can't do anything you want with them, but I can. You can't leave a bag of Chick-fil-A in my car, but I can. You can't leave your shoes in the middle of the floor, but I can. It's mine. You can't discipline my children to an extent, but I can. They're mine. But suddenly, when we look at how God is acting in our lives, no, God. You don't have the right to ask that of me. This is my life. Free will. I have some bad news for people who plant a flag in free will with God. I'm coming to the belief that free will has everything to do with sin and not anything to do with a relationship with Jesus. God has given us the free will to choose things that are not of him. And you know what? We're really good at it. And so you and I live our lives dissatisfied with how God is acting in this world. And therefore we refuse to respond like Jesus is here. That Messiah is here. Just like the people of Israel. They kept on with their life. They kept on and they kept on and they kept on. And to this day, they keep on, refusing to recognize that Jesus is here. Messiah has come. God with us, Emmanuel. And so we must recognize that Jesus is here. We must take a step back from our own desires and recognize that God is here. And God's greatest desire is not that you would succeed. It's not that you would be healthy. It's not that you would have long life. It's not even that you would use your talents and gifts that he's given you for him. God's greatest desire is that you would be with him. What would it look like? What would look differently about your life if you truly recognized that Jesus' presence was here? What would look different if you truly recognized Jesus' presence in your life? Because most of us live our lives daily not thinking about that idea. I mean, I'm preparing sermons sometimes. I'm getting music ready. I'm parenting my children. I'm hanging out with friends. And the fact that God is here, Jesus is here, right here. Like not just ethereally here. I mean like here. As you and I are here, he's here. What would look differently if we lived that out? What would it look like if you, in your work life, if you recognized that Jesus' presence was with you? Would you do your work unto him instead of just to satisfy a boss? Would ethical decisions be a whole lot easier if you were living and breathing in the idea that Jesus' presence was here? What would it look like in your family, in your home? How about in your friendships? I think for guys, and myself included, our friendships sometimes are the area that we tend to compartmentalize our faith the most, right? Well, I don't want to be pushy. I don't want to be the Jesus freak at the game, right? And so we might not indulge to the degree that some of our friends do in certain things or language or activity, but we certainly don't stand up for the truth of Jesus. We don't live in our friendships as though Jesus was literally here. Ladies, I'd say you do the same thing, but in a different way, but it's more like gossip is the challenge. And that's not to say guys don't gossip. We just do it differently. What would it look like in our church? I mean, what would be different about how we do church, how we live as church, how we go on mission if we recognize that Jesus was present with us? If we recognize that Jesus is here. And I know I keep repeating that phrase, but listen, I want you to dwell on it. I want when you wake up in the morning to recognize, Jesus, you are with me. I'm not waiting on your arrival. I'm living in your arrival. I'm not waiting for you to move, God. I'm living in your movement. I want you to go to sleep at night. Thank you, God, for a day that you've given me and the rest that you've provided for me. Living in that. That as we sleep, as our bodies unconsciously rest, that God is actively at work in our lives, present physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. So as we start this series together, as we begin this season of celebration of Christ's arrival, I want us to start right there. We're going to get into some more thick things, like how do we love like Jesus is here? How do we worship like Jesus is here? How do we live? How do we work? All these things, all these little intricacies to our lives. But I just want us to start. What would it look like if we recognized that Jesus is here? What would look different about your life, your day? I'm betting there's going to be a whole lot less anxiety and stress if we truly recognize Jesus' presence in our lives. It doesn't remove the difficulty. It just takes us off the throne and puts him on it.